President, around the halls of Congress this week are some wonderful folks walking around in green shirts, trying to save our rural schools and many, many rural communities across our country. These are folks who come from areas like mine where the federal government owns much of the land. And for decades and decades in these communities, they secured money for funding schools and our state for a variety of other services like police and essential needs for counties through federal timber payments. As the distinguished President of the Senate knows, as a result of environmental law changes and other policies, these communities have been strapped for funds now for quite some time. In 2000, the distinguished senator from Idaho and I, Senator Craig, wrote legislation that brought essential funds to these communities so that they could secure quality education for their students, for their families. But the law expired in 2006. So we sought then to extend this program on a multi-year basis. We had a vote here in the United States Senate, overwhelming support for the legislation, 74 senators voting for it, but the other body wasn't able to pass the legislation. So at that time, the program was extended for just 1 year, and now it appears that unless additional help is passed in this Congress, we are going to see many of these communities simply not able to survive. I've been told that in my state alone, 2 rural communities would simply have to shut their doors, and we're looking at the prospect of the state taking over those communities. Now, the reason all those folks in the green shirts are walking the corridors this week is they're making one last-ditch effort to get the funding passed before these county governments have to make what are not just drastic cuts to their budgets permanent, but cuts that will be so severe, as I've indicated, the community simply could not survive. The energy tax extenders bill is the last best hope for getting this done, and as a result of the exceptional work done by Chairman Baucus and Senator Grassley, the multi-year reauthorization of the county payments legislation has been included in their proposal. I think a number of colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been very, very supportive of this effort. I particularly want to express my thanks to Chairman Baucus, the distinguished leader, Senator Reid, the chairman of the Energy Committee, Jeff Bingaman. All of them have been enormously helpful as we have prosecuted this cause for months on end. On the Republican side, Senator Grassley has been extraordinarily helpful. Senator Craig, who authored this legislation originally with me, has been very helpful. Senator Smith of my home state continues to strongly support this effort, and I'm also very grateful to Senator Crapo from Idaho, who continually brings up at practically every session of the Senate Finance Committee how important it is to reauthorize this proposal. Mr. President, I know in the last few weeks of our fall session, it is going to be easy to block legislation and hard to pass it. But I am very hopeful that the energy tax legislation, which includes the county payments legislation, which has the strong bipartisan support of Chairman Baucus and Ranking Member Grassley, will prevail here in the Senate and will go to the House of Representatives. For literally decades, support from the federal government for these essential services, particularly schools in much of the country, but fighting meth and law enforcement and other essential services in my state, has in effect been part of a bigger agreement with the federal government. In effect, what happened, Mr. President, is something like 100 years ago. When the National Forest System was created, the communities that had largely forested areas said, we're going to offer a benefit to all the people of this country in terms of the National Forest System. But in return for placing these lands in public ownership, our communities would get support for essential services. And for decades and decades, that went on, and it was quite beneficial to both sides, to the rural communities and to the federal government. And we saw in my home state people from all over the country come and enjoy the National Forest System in Oregon and other communities around the United States. But we saw in the late 70s and the 80s, because of the change in environmental policy and changes in the size of the timber cut, the money shriveled up for these rural communities. And so it is essential that we pass this legislation, particularly for this multi-year purpose, because it is our sense, Mr. President, that in these rural communities, they know that they have to look in the future to a variety of other opportunities to have family wage employment. For example, in our part of the world, we hope to have a very significant job-creating program to thin out the second growth trees. This is an opportunity to get merchantable timber to the mills, but do it in a way that helps family wage employment and is good for the environment. We're going to have rural communities and folks from the forest product sector and environmental leaders supporting us in this effort. And in the other body, a friend of the President, myself, Congressman DeFazio, has championed a similar effort. But to have the time to set in place these new programs, such as thinning and biomass, where we can create clean energy from our forests, we're going to need a bit of time for that transition. And that is why this multi-year program is so extraordinarily important. Mr. President, it's my view that the best opportunity we've had for some time to get county payments passed has come about because of the strong bipartisan work done here in this chamber to add county payments to the energy tax legislation. It is my hope, just as we did when 74 senators came together to support the original legislation I offered in this session, that once again we can get strong bipartisan support for county payments as part of the energy tax bill. If we can get it sent from the United States Senate in a timely way to the other body, I think this time it will be possible to thread the needle, secure the funding for our rural communities, give them the opportunity to make the transition to these other areas that will allow them to strengthen their economy, and particularly bring to our schools, to our law enforcement agencies, the tools that are so desperately needed at this critical time.